peace of mind comes from accepting the worst. Now, I hope I'm not the only one that has the problem of having something really important to do, but then deciding not to do it, and then turning on the computer and watching a show, or watching a YouTube video. I mean, maybe that's what you're doing right now. But in this video, I want to share with you from the book, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, 3 practical steps you can take, a magic formula, if you will, to get your life back on track, to take back control, and to start moving closer to your goals, to start living. You ready? Now, this method of solving worrying situations is introduced to us by a guy named William H. Carrier, who is the founder and CEO of the Carrier Corporation, a company that makes air conditioning. Isn't that cool? It's still here after having been founded for over 100 years. Cool! No pun intended. You know what else is cool? Hitting that like button down below. Now, when Mr. Carrier was young, he worked for the Buffalo Forge Company, and he was handed an assignment of installing a gas device to another company at their plant, which costed millions of dollars. Now, the purpose of installing this gas device was so that the gas could be burned without impurities. That way you wouldn't injure the engine. This was totally new. Granted, this was like early 1900s, okay? So Mr. Carrier obviously came across a lot of unforeseen circumstances. I mean, this way of doing things has only been done once before and under totally different conditions. Nevertheless, the job got done, but it still did not meet expectations, and all of a sudden, just because of him, the company was facing a $20,000 problem. Granted, this was a time when you could buy a loaf of bread for 5 cents. $20,000 was a lot. Needless to say, he was worried, and in his words, and I quote, "I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while I was so worried I couldn't sleep." I don't know if this phrase identifies with you. Have you ever been so worried that you couldn't fall asleep? Eventually, common sense kicked in for Mr. Carrier, and he realized 3 steps that would propel him to create the company that is still standing today, over 100 years later. Here are the 3 steps. Step number 1, you want to analyze the situation honestly and fearlessly to really figure out what exactly is the worst thing that can happen to you as a result of this failure. Okay, so what was the worst thing that could have happened for Mr. Carrier? Well, for one, he wasn't gonna die, right? Nobody was gonna shoot him, nobody was gonna put him in jail. So what was it that could happen? Well, for one, he could have lost his job, that's likely. He could have gotten demoted, that's also possible. And he might have even had to make up the $20,000 or some portion of it because it was lost because of him. But that's it, and that's enough for us to move on to step number 2, which is after figuring out what the worst that can happen is, you try to reconcile it to yourself and accept that as a reality. So for Mr. Carrier, he really had to sit down with himself and talk to himself. So he had to be kind of like, yes, I could lose my job because of this, and if I do, I won't have enough money for the next while, but I can always go out and find another job. I can always go out and find work. And as far as my employers go, well, $20,000 in the face of the whole company really isn't that much money. And my bosses, they know that this is a new type of gas device. It's only been done once before under totally different conditions. So they might be thinking of this as an experiment, if you say. So that might actually happen. And you know what? After discovering what the worst thing that can happen actually is, and then reconciling yourself, if necessary, to that situation, you'll actually feel a sense of peace, a sense of calm that you haven't felt before. Because before you were anxious, you didn't really think about the true weight of the consequences of the situation. And because you didn't actually write it down, you didn't actually formalize it in your mind, you didn't actually come up with strategies, you didn't actually consider everything, our mind likes to take things out of proportion and blow everything up. You know what I mean? Sometimes the smallest things can cause the biggest worries, the biggest strifes, the biggest arguments. When really, if we take the time to sit down and just ponder, consider the reality of the situation and what we can do about it and how it usually doesn't mean the end of the world, then we can move on to step number 3, which is from the moment that you've reconciled with the worst that can happen, devote your time and energy all on improving upon the worst that can actually happen. After all, you've already accepted the worst scenario mentally, so anything that you can improve on will be a gain. And really that's what Mr. Carrier did. He sat down and he thought about it, he accepted the worst scenario, and then he tried to improve on it. And he thought to himself, alright, if we spend another $5,000, we can probably fix the problem. And that's exactly what they did. They spent another $5,000 and they fixed the problem. And instead of losing $20,000, they made $15,000. So all of a sudden, we made $15,000. Isn't that great? You see, his mindset was not, oh, instead of making $20,000, now we're only gonna make $15,000. Oh my gosh. His mindset was, instead of losing $20,000, which would have happened if the problem was not solved, now they're making $15,000. That's plus 15. That is good. So the moment you start accepting the worst case scenario mentally, you can start improving upon it. And Dale Carnegie goes on to sum this up nicely in the words of William James, the father of applied psychology. In his words, he says, "Be willing to have it so, because acceptance of what happened is the first step to overcoming the consequences of any misfortune." Halfway across the world in the East, Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang says the same thing. He says, true peace of mind comes from accepting the worst. I think for me, one of my biggest struggles is accepting the worst. Like, I cannot even imagine what life would be like if my parents were gone. Like, if my dad wasn't here, if my mom wasn't here anymore. I mean, they take care of me, they cook for me when I'm home, we talk regularly, and I just can't imagine them out of my life. But at the same time, I understand that that's a dangerous thing, because if I haven't accepted it mentally beforehand, I know it would be so hard for me when it actually happens. And so there came a day where I literally had to sit down with myself and say to myself, hey Leon, one day they're not going to be here anymore. The parents that took care of you, that raised you, that loved you their whole life, they're not going to be there anymore. And the worst thing that can happen is on the day that they pass, or after they pass, you realize that you wasted your life by not spending the precious amount of time you have together with them. And so it was at that moment when I was like, all right, Leon, you have to give them that hug that you want to give them. You have to go to that place you want to go with them. Go on that vacation. You have to talk to them. Send them a message when you want to. Because any moment, any extra moment that you've gained is precious, because it could have been nothing. And so by thinking that way, my focus is no longer on what's gonna happen when they're gone, but instead on what can I do while they're still here. I stopped worrying and I started living. The story of Earl P. Haney will bring my point home. It was the year 1975 when he was rushed to the hospital because he had hemorrhaging in his stomach, and it turned out that he had stomach ulcers. The doctors were saying that it was going to be incurable, and tubes had to be passed down into his stomach from his throat in order to feed him. This went on for months, and at one point, he decided he would not live like that anymore. He's told himself, if I had only a few months left to live, I do not want to spend my remaining months with a tube in my mouth, getting fed nutrients by doctors who were telling me that I was incurable. Guess what he did? He decided to get on a cruise ship that would sail to the east, to China and India. The doctors thought he was crazy and certainly he would be buried at sea. But as soon as he got on that ship, he started feeling better. He started eating more variety of foods over time. He started playing games and interacting with the guests. He started living. He started making the best of the remaining life that he had. And then a miraculous thing happened. By the end of his trip, he was cured. Not only that, but he came back with a boatload of treasured experiences with people and connections that he's made, and he's never looked back since. And it wasn't until he came back that he realized he had unconsciously applied the 3 principles William H. Carrier had applied 100 years ago to make him successful. And these same principles I urge you to apply today if you worry about anything at all. Ask yourself, what is the worst thing that can happen to you as a result of the situation? Number 2, accept it. Prepare to accept it as the worst if necessary. And then number 3, put your energy into living. Put your energy into improving upon that situation, because anything better than that is gain. Hey, so that was chapter 2 of how to stop worrying and start living. I learned so much. I hope you did as well. And if you did, we're going to go into chapter 3 in a future week. So please remember to subscribe to this channel and like the video. And hey, if you have a friend that worries too much, please share this video with them and let's learn together. Peace.